Good afternoon. My name is Joey Kotfika, and I'm a Public Information Officer at MTC ABAG, and I'd like to welcome you to MetroTalks, a series of public forums to seed and exchange ideas on how the Bay Area can transform for the better. Today's panel is meant to take stock of the election with a focus on equity and how to advance a more inclusive Bay Area. The next 60 minutes will be split between a conversation with our panelists, followed by a moderated audience Q&A session. Some quick housekeeping items. Please be mindful that there are many different voices here, so be respectful and graceful with each other. Audience members will be able to ask questions via Poll Everywhere throughout the session, with questions answered in the second half. Staff will also be monitoring Facebook and YouTube comments if you prefer to ask your questions on those platforms. Before the discussion begins, we're going to briefly check out the Poll Everywhere platform to give everyone some practice. So please open up your web browser to pollev.com/MTCABAG302, or you can text MTCABAG302 to 22333. That's 22333 to join via text. Let's do a few warm-up icebreakers to find out who is in the room today. Which county do you live in? Choose A for Alameda, B for Contra Costa, C for Marin, etc. And we'll give everyone just a little bit to answer those questions. All right, we've got those answers coming in. A lot of folks from Alameda, some folks from San Francisco, San Mateo's on the line. All right, I think we can move on to the next question. How did you cast your vote on November 3rd? Choose A for mail-in ballot, B for early in-person location, etc. And if you're joining via text, you only have to text to MTC ABAG 302 one time, and then you can participate from there. All right, now we've got some answers coming in. A lot of people with the mail-in ballots this year, for sure. COVID is definitely a concern, so it's great that a lot of people were able to vote by mail. All right, let's move on to the next question. What would you like to hear about most today? Choose A for Prop 15, choose B for Prop 16, etc. It's a race for the first, Prop 16 or the Biden administration. Got some folks who want to talk about Prop 15 as well. Terrific. All right, I think we can move on to the final question. So on this page, you'll be able to both pose questions for our panelists and give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to questions from other audience members. Staff will be monitoring this page as well as our Facebook and YouTube comments throughout the presentation to gather your questions for the second half of our talk. So you can keep this window open and it will be available for you to enter questions as we go along. And with that, I'd like to pass off the mic to MTC ABAG's Manager of Government Relations, Rebecca Long, who will be moderating today's session.
Great. Thank you, Joey. And welcome to our fourth round in our remote series of MetroTalks, recognizing the increased need for space to reflect and think critically about how the communities that make up the 9-county Bay Area respond together to our historic challenges. It's also a critical time for lifting up equity, holding to a shared vision of just and fair inclusion in a Bay Area where everyone can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. We're excited to continue these conversations with 3 experts in today's debrief conversation on the election results and their implications for advancing equity across the Bay Area. Each will share their unique perspective on local and statewide propositions, as well as the national results and what they mean for advancing equity across our region. So next, I'd like to introduce the panelists. Darnell Grisby is the brand new Executive Director of Transform, a leading policy advocacy nonprofit advancing equitable, sustainable transportation and land use solutions in California. Darnell has deep expertise in anti-racist initiatives, housing affordability, transit-oriented development, and the intersection of transportation and housing finance. Formerly, he served as the Director of Policy Development for the American Public Transportation Association, Policy Lead for Smart Growth America, a national think tank, and is a Senior Advisor in the California Legislature. The next panelist is Judith Bell. Judith is the Chief Impact Officer at the San Francisco Foundation, one of the nation's largest community foundations, dedicated to advancing racial equity and economic inclusion in the Bay Area. Judith supports the foundation in defining how to advance these goals. She also serves on the board of Prosperity Now, which focuses on the racial wealth gap, and previously served as president of Policy Link, a national leader on equity based here in the Bay Area. And our third and final panelist is Alvaro Sanchez, who is the Director of Environmental Equity at the Greenlining Institute, a policy research, organizing, and leadership institute, also based here in the Bay Area, working for racial and economic justice. An urban planner by training, Alvaro leads a team that develops policies to improve public health, catalyze economic opportunity, and enrich environmental quality for low-income communities and communities of color by leveraging public resources that address pollution, fight climate change, and help vulnerable communities adapt to a changing environment. We're so honored to have the three of you join us here today. Just a quick reminder before we begin the conversation. Again, we encourage you to use Poll Everywhere to pose your questions to the speakers and or to staff. As moderator, I am committed to maintaining a safe space for sharing thoughts and ideas, and I'll be coordinating with my colleague Joey, who will be curating the questions. So now let's turn to our first question. And I'd just like to open it up to each of you to share your thoughts about the results of the statewide ballot measures. I'm curious about your take on the failure of Prop 15, dealing with property taxes, the failure of Prop 21, allowing greater rent control, and the success of Prop 22, which classifies gig workers as contractors. Were you surprised by these results? And if you were disappointed, what do you see as a potential path forward? And let's start with Alvaro.
Hi, everyone. Buenas tardes. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And I was very surprised of the results and disappointed in the missed opportunity that I think we had as a state to really make progress towards equity and justice. I really felt that justice was on the ballot this year for many reasons, including the legislative proposals that were included here. And it's disappointing to know that they weren't as successful as we thought they were. But I think what it indicates to me anyway is that we can't lose the sight on just the hard work of educating, organizing, and meeting people where they're at. I think as we go through this panel, I'll share some of my thoughts around what was the conditions that were created that allow these propositions to not be successful. And I think one of them, a big one, is just, I think the message didn't quite make it into the communities that needed to hear it. I think it was a very crowded field. I think there was a lot of misinformation, a lot of confusion, and ultimately, I think some of the existing channels that we use to get the word out need to be innovated upon because people are getting their information in very different ways these days. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel and the conversation, but I would say that I'm disappointed, but not defeated. I think we can still do a lot towards addressing the issues that didn't make it on the ballot. We're just going to have to take a different form, but I'll share the time with my fellow panelists.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alvaro. Judith, how about you? Oh, you're on mute, Judith. It's bottom left.
I got it. So sorry. I'll build on what Alvaro said. I was disappointed. The foundation has been a big supporter of Prop 15. We were there with resources and leadership. We engaged our donors. We spoke out, and we worked in partnership with the campaign. and with other public charities, other community foundations in particular around the region. But, while the initiative lost, I think there's actually all sorts of really important and historic wins that happened in the campaign. And the first thing I would lift up is, previous to this campaign, Prop 13 from the 1970s, it was seen as this political third rail. You cannot touch it. And if you do, you're going down to defeat, and you're going down to defeat in a very big way. And that's not what happened. I mean, the initiative lost, obviously, but it lost by a very small amount, probably be about 600,000 votes at in an election with historic turnout. Will be probably 17 million or more votes in the state. And in the process, the measure, I think, really showcases the opportunity for what it can look like as we build a power building infrastructure, movement building infrastructure in the state that's really led by people of color. I mean, the initiative had 1,600 endorsers, 750 local electeds. The governor was in support. They gathered 1.7 million signatures. And here's another factoid that actually I think is super exciting. There were 25,000 volunteers. So just an enormous effort across the state. A couple other things I wanted to lift up. We're in the Bay Area. The Bay Area was in huge support of the measure. 68% of voters in Alameda County, 71% in San Francisco, 59% in San Mateo. I could bounce around the Bay Area. We were very important and actually really the premier place for support. And this was a very broad coalition with business and labor, community, racial justice groups, philanthropy, and tech. The one thing I want to lift up before I pause for Darnell to jump in is that I do think we were really hurt by the COVID crisis because, the big secret weapon in the campaign was the ground game with all these different groups. And that was completely taken out of our tool belt. And so groups really had to scramble to make sure they were fully leveraging digital infrastructure. They had to build some of that digital infrastructure. I think that really was the margin that we needed to be able to pass the measure. But this issue is in play now, and it's not going away. And the financial status of the state and counties and localities really speaks to the need for this measure to pass at some point.
I would say the election is proof that demography is not destiny. California is a majority people of color state with a large progressive white community, and these initiatives still did not do well. And we saw similar results around the country. So I think communities that we oftentimes might have viewed as turnout communities may in fact be persuasion communities because just like Alvaro said, those communities are impacted by the same types of information and misinformation that everyone else is. So we have to redesign how we reach out to these communities. One study that I found interesting was when we had the repeal of Prop 6 on the ballot, communities of color underperformed versus their partisan lean. And what that means is they voted for the repeal of the gas tax more often than their partisan lean would say that they should. So once again, it's proof that these are not turnout communities, they are persuasion communities that need to have messaging directed towards them, and they need to be listened to.
Okay, great. Thank you all for those insightful comments on that first question. The next question is going to be for Judith. Judith, with an incoming Biden administration that has named racial justice as one of its 4 priorities, what do you see as the biggest areas of opportunity to advance equity at the federal level, and how will this change some of the work that the San Francisco Foundation prioritizes here in the Bay Area?
Yeah, I feel like I could spend a lot of time listing the ways that we will see a change here. I mean, let's just start with the fact that we have a woman of color as the vice president-elect, and how profound a moment that was. I mean, the speech that she gave, that Senator Harris gave, Vice President-elect Harris gave, was just incredibly moving. Looking at the young girls who were in the audience and speaking with friends and family, just a very moving moment. So that's huge. And then we have a president-elect who has been speaking about systemic racism and talking about how that needs to be a part of the agenda. So I think wherever we pivot in this new administration, we're going to see change. I mean, think about just like something small where supposedly like no more training on bias and discrimination. I am sure that's going to be removed. We know on day one that the vice president-elect plans to take all sorts of steps. DACA recipients, for instance, and we have hundreds of thousands of DACA recipients here in not just the Bay Area, but the state. Those folks really can take a breath and not worry as much. I'm hopeful that the new administration also will take different steps on immigration and deportation, not just of the Trump administration, but frankly also of the Obama administration, that we will see a new day there. Obviously, some of this will depend on the Senate, but there is a lot we've learned in this administration that can happen by executive order and by regulation. So I think we will start to see things roll back. For instance, I expect at HUD, we will see, for instance, the reintroduction of a measure that the Trump administration threw out that was designed to allow folks to live in communities of opportunity. It was called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. And I expect that in some way, shape, or form, it will come back and that we'll see work in labor, work in transportation. I mean, wherever you pivot, I think there will be a real attention to thinking about how the administration can open up opportunity, can pay attention to racial equity, and can move rules and resources to allow that to advance across the country.
Okay, thank you. Now turning a little bit more specifically to transportation, Darnell, I'd love to hear your thoughts about two wins on this past ballot. One for Caltrain, which won its bid for its first ever dedicated operating funding source and 8% sales tax. And then in Sonoma County, there was a renewal of a 1/4-cent sales tax also dedicated to transportation. So what are your thoughts about these and what they mean for equity? I believe Transform endorsed both of them.
We did. And, in this year where we've had mixed news, it's been great to have those two wins. I think moving the ball with funding transit more broadly is part of the pro-equity agenda. So we needed those wins. There are questions about the salience of sales tax when it comes to advancing social equity, particularly given the relatively high sales tax we have in the region. So those are issues to confront together, to talk about, and to develop a strategy long-term about how we address inequities caused by sales tax being so high. But those are important wins, and we should celebrate them in this relatively difficult year for the propositions that we wanted to have passed and did not have passed.
Okay, great, thank you. And now a question for Alvaro. Turning again to the national level, Alvaro, would love to hear your thoughts about, what it means to have a new administration that not only believes climate change is real, but has identified it as one of their top 4 priorities. And how will that change some of the work that Greenlining does, either within California or nationally? And do you plan to engage on the national level?
Yeah, thank you. First, I want to just emphasize what Judith started with, how much it means that we have an incoming administration that believes in science, that is explicit about racial injustice, that is taking COVID-19 very seriously. These things are just the kinds of messages that allow people to say, we can work towards solutions versus just scared about what happens to our communities, to our families, to our people when we have an administration that is explicitly against all those things. So I think that just it's a huge thing. It's a huge change that really we need to really celebrate, because it took a lot to make that happen. But specifically on what the Biden administration is thinking about as it relates to climate issues and how it's going to impact California and the Bay Area. Number one, I think that there's a lot actually that the Biden administration can learn from things that we are doing here in California now. On climate issues, specifically on investment issues for strategies that mitigate pollution, we've done a lot of progress. The programs that we've been able to implement out of the California Climate Investments portfolio have a lot of lessons that the federal government should really take a hard look at in figuring out how do they structure a national program that seeks to replicate some of those things. Of course, the Senate is going to be really important for that in terms of allocating the necessary funding for it, but that doesn't mean that the administration cannot look at the design of what could potentially become something that they operate through executive action or through stimulus funding or a heavy investment in climate strategies. So learning from the examples of California is going to be key. So our role is going to have to be able to package that and share that with our colleagues, the California delegation, and then ultimately with folks that are working at that federal level. So learning from both our successes, but also our missteps, because we've had them. And I think it's important for them to not go down some of the paths that we decided to go on here in California. That's one. Number two, I think that hoping that the new incoming administration thinks about the multiple crises that people are having to deal with currently, COVID, climate change, and an economic crisis, and trying to figure out how to deploy strategies that are multi-sectoral in their approach and not siloed in what they're trying to do. So that it allows us to think about how to develop strategies that are solving for multiple issues. So as it relates to things that are happening in the Bay Area, thinking about climate smart infrastructure investments, thinking about how to enhance our ability for people to use public transit in a safe way and in a way that actually helps us reduce greenhouse gases and vehicle miles traveled. Thinking about how do you use some of the strategies that we've had to use in emergency circumstances, like slow streets, open space, outdoor dining, parklets, and how do you keep some of those permanent because they actually contributed to better quality of life. So I feel like there's just a lot that could happen, but it's going to have to be, we're going to have to be very intentional about being multi-sectoral, multi-benefit in our approach so that we don't go down the path of shovel-ready projects, low-hanging fruit, and the types of things that are actually really bad for equity. Any of those things, if you hear shovel-ready, if you hear low-hanging fruit, that pretty much signals that you're going to go for something that's already built, not something that needed community members to come together and champion more. So I really want to be cautious about the idea of prioritizing only shovel-ready projects, because those tend to be the projects that community has never had an opportunity to engage with or participate in their making. And we really need to be able to build the capacity and the partnership with those folks for these investments to have long-term success. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunities, both from what we can share with them about how to do this, but also on what opportunities it opens for us to make the appropriate investments in our communities that we need to fight these multiple crises that we're dealing with.
Thank you. That's a really interesting point about the shovel ready. I hadn't heard that kind of analysis of the tie to equity there. So I appreciate that. We're moving very quickly here. So this next question.
On the national by any chance?
What's that?
Can I chime in on the national?
Yeah,
picture?
please do. Please do.
This is my first week back in California. I was born and raised in California. 10 years ago, I moved to DC because I was excited about the Obama administration and what we could accomplish. And I arrived fall of 2010, right before we lost the House. And in the years I spent there, I saw our potential and our avenues for affecting change get more and more narrow every year. And part of that is because of the political environment in which the last administration had to operate in. And I want to make sure that we don't have a repeat of that. I think a lot of the power that we saw earlier this year is one reason why Biden is now the president-elect. People took to the streets. They actually had sound policy proposals that they had been thought about, had been thinking about for decades, and had a chance to actually bring to the fore. And we have to maintain that level of power, continue to do power building in our community to make sure that the political environment that this new administration is facing is not going to lead to the same problems and outcomes that we saw from the Obama administration, which wanted to do a lot of things and found themselves increasingly having to do primarily regulatory administrative changes that increasingly were beat back by the courts. And we know that the courts have been packed in the last 4 years by the Trump administration. So these are some of the conditions and atmospherics that we have to operate in.
Thank you for chiming in on that. So the next question deals with arguably the most focused on equity ballot measure this past election, and that was Prop 16, which would have repealed the ban on affirmative action. MTC and ABAG endorsed this measure as a meaningful step that we could take toward advancing racial and gender equity, and we were hardly alone. There were many big name endorsements, including Governor Gavin Newsom, President-elect Kamala Harris, not to mention the Golden State Warriors, the 49ers, Twitter, the list goes on and on. Yet despite that and a period of national reckoning with systemic racism, it failed in all but 6 counties. I'm glad to say that 4 of those were here in the Bay Area. But what is your takeaway about why the majority of California voters rejected this measure, particularly at a time of national reckoning with systemic racism? And do you think the proponents should take another shot soon? I just would love to hear each of your thoughts on this. And why don't we start with Darnell this time?
So I think California and America in general has a very difficult time with the race, obviously. I think when it comes to this proposition, our framing around meritocracy is being born as problematic, being shown as being problematic. And it's not based on an anti-racist frame. An anti-racist frame assumes that there's not issues with individuals when you see inequitable outcomes. It assumes that there's processes and systems in place that are the reason why those individuals may be not fulfilling their life the way that others may be, which is why we need to have government programs like affirmative action to intervene in that situation to correct those imbalances. I think America views meritocracy as the individual pursuit, one that is not impacted by systemic racism or systemic sexism or homophobia. And I think we have to get back to the crux of the issue that if you see people who are poor and you assume that they are poor because of their individual circumstance, that may not be an anti-racist frame that you're using. And by the way, communities of color are impacted by the same types of thinking. And I will be direct. When I was younger, I probably was impacted by some of the same thinking. And it took exposure and learning, particularly through the prism of what we went through in the 1990s in California when we had Prop 209. And the view of meritocracy then has not really changed since the 1990s, which is why we had Prop 209 in the first place. It's based on a racist impulse, and we need to have better education with everyone about, systemic racism and failure.
Absolutely. Alvaro, how about you?
Yeah, this was one of the more disappointing ones for this session. And of course, I don't think folks quite know yet why the response to this one was the way that it was. But a couple of things that I've been thinking about since learning about the results. The first one is that we probably have a whole generation of voters who don't realize that Prop 209 was a thing. So I wonder how much of that actually comes into play when, in some ways, as a state, we've gotten used to, by necessity, not having to rely on race as a way to try to address inequities in our state. And I think that it's surprising to me to know how quickly people may have forgotten about this, but it's not actually unbelievable because, as you know, I work at the Green Lining Institute, and you would be surprised how many presentations we give to very educated folks who have been doing work on economic issues, on real estate issues, on planning issues, and how many of them don't know what redlining is, like where the root of that was and what the impact of that is. And I feel like that there's something there in how long since Prop 209, we've had to just figure it out in another way. So I wondered how much of that lack of education and acknowledgement contributed to this. The second piece is, again, I'll go back to just the amount of misinformation that there was. I spent the week leading up to the election with my parents in LA. My parents are Spanish-speaking folks. They don't speak English. It was amazing to see how much messaging was being pumped into that community on all of the issues that we're talking about from the forces that didn't want them to succeed. They were being targeted heavily on a against message, and it was very few messages that we saw specifically on Prop 16 on the opposite end. So I think that also really confused the issue. But moving forward, I will say that it's disappointing that it didn't pass, but it's not the only thing that we can do to address inequities in our state. One of the things that Greenlining has been proposing for the better part of this year has been the fact that we need to establish at the state level an Office of Equity. And it could be, we were hoping to be more bold in saying it has to be an Office of Racial Equity. But if it's not racial equity because of Prop 209, we need to have a systematic approach on how to confront the inequities in our state, and it has to be at a systems level. It can't be done by one agency or one department or in piecemeal. It has to be a comprehensive strategy on what we do to address the issues that our state is confronting with when it comes to issues of equity. The state of Washington earlier this year established the first statewide Office of Racial Equity. And I think California is ready to do something similar and allow for us to have a comprehensive strategy for how we're going to address all of the inequities that our state is continuing to face. So that's something that I think we will still continue to promote despite the defeat of Prop 16. And I think we have the opportunity to be able to do that through a legislative process. But I'll pause there and allow Judith to contribute.
Yeah, I think there's a number of really important pieces to Prop 16 to take a look at because it was a pretty unique initiative in several ways. First off, it came to the ballot in a very different way because it came from the legislature. And the vote of the legislature was also pretty late in the process. So we didn't know until June that Prop 16 was going to be on the ballot. And you can compare that, right, to the example we were talking about earlier around Prop 15, where years beforehand, that initiative was on the ground, gathering signatures, and moreover, doing research about what did the public understand? Where were voters positioned? What did the campaign need to look like? In the case of Prop 15, they actually changed the name. They changed the name of the measure because they learned where voters were at, and they learned the best way to be educating voters. Here, all the research began really in a deep way once the initiative was on the ballot in June. So they had an enormous hurdle to get over. And Alvaro, you're actually right. Most voters didn't even know about Prop 209. Some folks who were voting weren't even, they weren't even conscious in any kind of way at the time that Prop 209 was passed. So there was this enormous hurdle of how are you going to educate folks? And then do you have the time and the resources to educate folks? And really the answer was the time and the resources weren't there. The polling showed that when you had a voter, when you had the time to describe to them what was in 209, what does it mean to talk about affirmative action? What does it open up when we get rid of that particular provision in California? Then people move to be a yes. But that's a process. The campaign needed time. It did not have the time. And then the other thing the campaign didn't have is it didn't have the infrastructure. So it didn't have the ability to engage groups and leaders from around the state to really dive into the kinds of conversations that allow people to learn and allow them to change their opinions. And I just think that we can't lose sight of that because we don't actually know yet what a real debate about these issues will look like. I guarantee if you ask people that most would not know that California, for instance, is one of only 9 states that has these restrictions in place. And I would add one other really important thing. I don't think voters make the connection between racial justice and racial equity and Prop 209 and affirmative action. And if you went back and looked at the language that was in the ballot, it was pretty confusing. So I don't think this was quite the statement from the public that it's being spun to be, because I don't think we had the real debate and discussion. And on top of it, I don't think people made the connection that this was in fact a really important racial justice measure, and that therefore they should be voting yes. And so I do think we need to continue in this fight. I do think it's incredibly important, and I do think we will need some time to do more research, to connect with voters, to bring in community leaders and community perspective. Alvaro's example is perfect. We need to have it right in a way that is reflective of culture and community, and that then we can come back to repealing the measure. You know, in all these discussions, I'm always reminded of the famous Martin Luther King quote about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And in each of these, we're learning that the bend takes longer than we would like, and that change takes sometimes longer than we would like. And I think we can say that change does happen. There is one other thing I wanted to lift up from the initiatives that we haven't touched on yet that I think is super important. And that's
before you do that, Judith,
okay.
Sorry, I just know Darnell wanted to jump in
go
again
for it, and then I'll come
on
back.
Prop 16 first before we leave that.
Go
ahead.
I was just going to say misinformation is powerful because it's rooted in schisms in our society. And one of the major social media companies a couple of years ago, I don't know if people remember, allowed people to see what kind of categories they were put into. And one of the categories that was notable for me was affinity towards African Americans. And you could be of any racial group and be in that category or not. And if you're not in that category, then you're open to a variety of types of misinformation. And I'm not sure if the side of equity is as well versed in those tools as the other side happens to be. And I also don't think that we are willing to play the way that they're willing to play. They play in very aggressive ways. I think we are more fact-based. We're less emotional. They play to people's emotions in a way that is categorically unfair, but highly effective.
Well said. Thank you for that. Judith, back to you. I think you wanted to touch on some of the other measures.
Yes, and thank you, Darnell. Those are really important points. What I actually wanted to touch on was the role of corporate money in this election, because there was $500 million spent by corporations. And when I say that, I feel like I need to repeat $500 million. Prop 15 was outspent more than 2 to 1 by corporate resources. And then we haven't touched on the incredible example of Prop 22. Where $220 million was spent by Uber and Lyft and the other app-based companies to draft that measure and push that measure. You know, it included, if you opened up the app, the first thing you saw was the ad on Prop 22. So enormous use of every kind of mechanism. I mean, anywhere you turned, they were spending money to get their message out. They understood how crowded this election season was, that people were paying attention nationally, they were paying attention to other states, and there were issues on the ballot in California, and they just spent their way to passing the measure. And embedded in that measure was a provision that said that the legislature cannot amend it without a 7/8 vote. And like, I used to lobby the legislature, Rebecca, you know this well. The only time we see the legislature voting like at 7/8 is when they're voting that Wednesday will be artichoke day. You know, it just doesn't happen hardly at all. And so they are both, you know, they drafted a measure, they pushed a measure, they passed a measure, and they set it really into concrete for a very long time. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent. If you were to look at the way that Prop 25 was financed, that is a similar kind of example. And right now, the tobacco companies have a measure on the street where they're trying to repeal the legislature's ban on flavored tobacco. So I think there are some very serious questions from this ballot about the role of corporate money in California that are going to be difficult ones to take on, but are super important, really, for the future of democracy.
Yeah, and sorry, if I could just, this is such a, thank you, Judith, for raising this. I will say it's scary to know the combination of wealth of the corporation and its ability to get its message to its customer base. I think to me that part was like, oh, wait a minute. So in the future, if we wanted to regulate things like Amazon, things like social media companies, other app-based technologies, they could really just like engage their customer base through the apps that they developed. That to me, like that combination, that full package, really left me kind of feeling like, wait a minute, like how is it that we're going to be able to compete against a captive audience that they already have? And not to mention that they could recruit other audiences through the wealth that they can deploy. I think it's really scary to see what happened with Prop 22 and to know that California was a test ground to what they could do outside of California. And I think we should be really cognizant of the success that Prop 22 had, because it points to not so great things, I think.
And
one last point on that. Oh, go ahead, Darnell. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think this goes back to the talent question too. So these companies are able to pick the best talent available because they're able to pay a premium. And a lot of the other folks are, we have people who are dedicated, but they may not have the same level of just ability to be as effective as some of the folks who work for these companies in terms of getting a message out and being strategists. I've been on the private side before, and I've noticed a difference, and it's a big difference because they can pay top dollar for the best talent.
One last just point on this. Alvaro's right that the companies are already thinking about exporting it. And here's another piece of information. So they invested $220 million, and the week after the election, the valuation for these companies jumped by $20 billion. So that's quite a return on their investment, and I do think we will see it exported to other states. And so it raises questions really for the nation as well as for California.
Absolutely. Yeah. And going back to Prop 16, I do think, the amount of money that was being poured into 22 really just crowded the airwaves and people's capacity to understand all of these different complex issues. So I think, just to your point earlier, Judith, that we shouldn't infer that this really tells us what people think about this question of affirmative action. There wasn't time, and then there was so much noise. Let's see. I wanted to invite you guys, if any of you would like to say anything more about any of the local measures that you might have been involved in, either things that you were happy about or other disappointments. Maybe Alvaro, is there anything that you guys were engaged in locally that you wanted to call out?
No, a lot of our work was just focused at the state level, so we weren't keeping track of local efforts as much. But I think that some of the information that was already shared, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to be more progressive and to kind of have more, of an aggressive position towards some of these equity conversations here in the Bay Area. I mean, if it's going to succeed, I think it's going to be here. So I don't know if, Darnell or Judith have any information about the local measures that maybe meet that mark.
Well, I can jump in with a couple that we were involved in. One was an effort, actually was an effort in San Francisco and in Oakland, the Oakland one succeeding. So Oakland passed Measure QQ, which gave the right to vote for 16 and 17-year-olds in school board elections. And that's quite a commentary about empowering youth. We know that, when youth are given the opportunity to engage early as voters and as participants, it turns into a lifelong practice. So this is really a new step by Oakland and potentially for other places around the state to give youth an opportunity to weigh in on something that impacts their daily life, that being the school board and school policy. Then on this question we were touching on earlier around revenues, right, which was tied to Prop 15, there were, and Darnell was lifting up some revenue issues as well, there were sales taxes on the ballot in both Contra Costa and Alameda County. The Contra Costa measure passed. The Alameda County one is ahead by like 500 votes. So we will see what will happen. Alameda County will use those dollars on homelessness, which helps a bit on the fact that sales taxes are regressive and are not a great way for bringing in revenue. But those two were also in the ballot. And the final thing I'd lift up is a measure in San Francisco. There was a provision put into the Constitution by segregationists in the 1950s that requires localities to say, yes, we want to approve the ability for city to actually build affordable housing. And so San Francisco passed approval for 10,000 affordable homes to be built there. And so that's a good sign for the future.
Yeah, that was very encouraging. There were a number of measures that weren't so pro density in other parts of the region. Darnell, were there any other local measures that you wanted to touch on, or any other aspects of that?
I think we touched on a couple. We were supportive of Measure K, which I think was just mentioned, the 10,000 units of social housing. I think those sort of things are very important. And as Alvaro said, it's a chance for us to be more progressive next time and fight a little harder.
Yeah. I always enjoy looking at the Secretary of State's maps that show, what the county outcome was on various ballot measures. And more often than not, you see the Bay Area as the inverse of whatever the rest of the state did. So we can take some encouragement from that. And actually, I'm looking at some of the questions now that are coming in. So thank you, audience members. I would encourage you to continue to ask questions. But yeah, this most popular question is, given the high support of Prop 15 in the Bay Area, is there some opportunity to chip away at this issue on a local level? And so I guess this is somewhat of a legal question. Just by way of background, I'll give some context and then ask any of you to weigh in. But Prop 15 was trying to amend Prop 13, which is in the state constitution. So it would be, quite complicated, I would think, to have separate property tax rules for just the Bay Area. But I think it would be feasible, but it would take a constitutional amendment. I don't know if any of you would like to weigh in on thoughts of whether that might be a good idea, or if we should continue to try to do a statewide fix.
I think the challenge is that we don't really have a regional mechanism to put this into play. You're right, Rebecca, about the constitutional measure, but even if we decided we wanted to do something on commercial property, for instance, we'd have to do it county by county. And so then I think that flips us back over to the state. I really think this is a good debate to continue at the state level and to push ourselves to get over that 50% hurdle.
And maybe one strategy to get there is to make it more regional in nature, because I think that give people more sense of control over their own destiny when it comes to their taxes.
Yeah, and I agree that the debate should, I think, continue at the state level. But I think what it indicates, again, thinking about a more progressive voter, crowd here in the Bay Area, I think to me it just means like, how do we develop revenue strategies that are at the regional scale, that are more progressive, that could, fulfill some of the commitments that would have been fulfilled by Prop 15. So I think that on that tip, I think there's a lot of innovation that needs to happen. Currently at the state level, there's a lot of conversations about needing to generate new revenue streams, but more often than not, we go back to the low-hanging fruit again, right? Sales tax, bond measures, increased real estate taxes. And I think we have to start thinking about, like, are there other approaches? So one that we're currently exploring is the idea of establishing zero emission zones as a way to reduce pollution and at the same time, potentially generate some revenue from entities that cannot deploy zero emission vehicles in that jurisdiction. This is like something that's being tried in several European cities. So we're exploring that for the California context, but I know that we will need probably some legislative approval at the state level to allow those to be implemented in a local jurisdiction. But I think that we have to innovate on how we generate revenue, because it's actually not a matter of not having revenue. The state of California has actually quite a lot of revenue. I think it's about it being concentrated in ways that are not healthy for our state.
As a progressive, one of the things I've always thought is we need to find a way to promote good governance and to show taxpayers that there's value for their money, and change the perception that government is somehow inefficient or a waste of their money, or that their money is going to things they don't particularly care about. That might provide a little bit more of an opening for us to ask for more. We have to confront this ideology that government is bad.
Okay. Yeah, one thing that my mind was going to is just the huge challenge that we have, thanks to Prop 13, again, of the 2/3 vote threshold for any special taxes. And I think that's what ultimately drives a lot of jurisdictions to sales taxes, because for whatever reason, they tend to have higher support than others. It will be really interesting to see how things evolve with the recent court decision allowing for referendums put on by the voters to pass with a majority vote. And we'll see where that goes in the evolution of revenue mechanisms. Are there any thoughts about kind of continuing on this theme of, Bay Area equity efforts, of revenue measures that could be explored within the 9 counties, potentially for housing or other needs that you guys are thinking about or that you'd like to share?
Well, we took the fantastic step of setting up the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, which you all are doing fantastic work at standing up, and we will need to get revenue for that authority so that it can do what needs to happen across the region in terms of producing and preserving affordable housing, but also protecting tenants. And so, I know that colleagues are already starting to think about, like, when's the right time to move a revenue measure? How do you make sure that it can deal with all those different questions right across the 3 Ps that tenants and what tenants need as part of that package, as well as production and preservation. So I think we're going to have to take steps on housing. It is such a critical issue. We know how many thousands of folks are just sitting on the edge of that eviction cliff, and the state has still not dealt with that. The nation hasn't dealt with that question. And so we're going to need to figure that out to make sure people can get into homes and stay in homes. And so I think that is one that the region is ripe to take on. I think there's no question that people believe in people's right to have a home and are prepared to vote for something that would deliver that, and to do it at the regional scale.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if I could just chime in on that, I think revenue is so badly needed for a bunch of different reasons. And I think, there will be opportunities to create those. But one of the things that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about is having revenue and deploying it, particularly in priority communities. That's like the one step in a process towards equity. Allowing the people who actually live there to reap the direct benefits from that revenue, it's almost the harder step, because we're not accustomed to doing that kind of work. So one of the recent pieces of work that we released is called the Green Line Economy Guidebook. And in it, we included a set of principles and standards or rules to try to figure out what needs to be included in the way that we spend public money so that we can actually have the intended outcomes that we're looking to achieve. And they're not like super revolutionary rules, but you'd be surprised how many of these are not found in the way that we spend money. This includes things like, emphasizing anti-racist solutions. Like, can we do that and include it in the way that we spend our money? Can we prioritize multi-sectoral approaches so that we're not siloed and just spending money on one thing when we can be spending money on things that actually maximize opportunity? Can we create wealth building opportunities through the way that we're spending our money? Can we build the capacity of local communities to actually engage in the process and be partners in doing this work? These are the kinds of rules that we don't often see included in the way that funding is being distributed, and I think we have to include those, because otherwise we go down to the playbook of how we make investments in community, and that playbook is often one that has many equity holes that we need to start fixing moving forward, so that we don't continue to have this dynamic where investments are happening in community, but the benefits are not actually being maximized because our rules are not allowing that to happen.
One area that we have an interest in is what we call equitable congestion pricing. And we did a paper on that, I think it was last year. And it's important because it changes the game and it makes transit a little bit more equal with highway, which is an equitable strategy. And also making sure we have rebates back to those low-income users of the highway network is another way of ensuring equity. So you reap revenue and you change the balance of power between transit and highway.
Thank you. Okay, a couple of other really good questions coming in. One goes back to the question of kind of significant private sector funding for campaigns. And what are your thoughts about taxing outsized contributions to any PAC that's contributing to or for or against a proposition, using some of that tax revenue to support factual and trusted information?
I think it's another legal question, unfortunately. We have Citizens United at the federal level that has completely, if we went back to that decision to now, I think we would just see this, I know we would see this incredible increase in corporate resources in campaigns. So I think it's a great idea. I just do not know if it's legal, given the constraints from Citizens United. And that's why we're going to have to be super creative, because we're constrained by that Supreme Court decision. And so we're going to have to figure out, how we can navigate around it in a way that gets to the very outcomes that the question is asking about.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, because money in that decision is speech.
Exactly. That's exactly. We've got protected speech, money.
Tax speech.
Yes, exactly.
And then one question that I thought would be, a nice gift that you all could offer is about how do we, better educate the California population about some of the equity issues, systemic racism issues. Are there any books that, you would like to see perhaps added to, the high school reading lists on these subjects that you'd like to share with the audience? This questioner actually included The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which I just found to be an incredible read, incredibly eye-opening, and particularly for the Bay Area, the number of examples of, restrictive covenants and the like that are in, our progressive region. So I would recommend that one. So I've taken one that probably is on your list, but would love to hear from all of you on that. So maybe I'll start with Darnell. Any recommended reads?
How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. I recommend it through Audible or some sort of audiobook, because you get to actually hear him read it and hear the emphasis. And it really moved me. And I think it's a great way to actually think about policy. And it goes back to, once again, when we see inequity, it is not the fault of the people who are caught in that system. It is the impact of the system itself on those individuals. And I think if we can get people to start thinking that way in a very basic way, we can have transformational policy opportunities.
Okay, Alvaro.
Yeah, y'all took the two that I was going to mention, so I'll just keep it there. But I'll just another plug for The Color of Law. It's required reading for all staff at Greenlining, and I think it's really a history that needs to be better known, because the ramifications of redlining are with us today. Like, we haven't gotten away from those, and I think we need to kind of confront that history as well.
So I would ditto on both of the two books. They're fantastic. We gave our board The Color of Law, and I love the idea of listening. I'm going to go back and actually listen to How to Be an Anti-Racist since I've read it. And I would add two other books, both by Isabel Wilkerson. The most recent one is Cast, which is brilliant and has shaken me down to my core. And then the beautiful Pulitzer Prize-winning book that she wrote earlier, which is one of my very favorites, called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is a beautiful set of stories about African Americans in the South and their travel to the North and what that represented. And she weaves in history with that. So both of her books are brilliant, and I highly recommend them.
Okay, excellent. Well, that seems like a great note to end on. I really just want to thank you all so much for joining us today. It was really an insightful discussion. And I think Joey's going to join us once again just to wrap things up.
Thank you for joining us for today's Metro Talk, and a big thank you to all of our panelists for this thoughtful and provocative session. A recording of this session will be on MTC's YouTube and Facebook pages, so please hit the like button and subscribe to our pages to access the latest. Thank you so much.